as midwives to such a significant project, and we're very grateful to Richard for entrusting us with it. So we hope you all either buy or get a copy and read and enjoy. Thank you.
I'm very glad to be here with you all this evening. Could you use the other full mic as well? I think if I leave it there, is that loud enough for everyone?
No, you need to be nearer to your microphone.
I think you need to hold it. Okay, I'll hold it.
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Richard and I worked out if we stood in this position, we could embrace those who are here in person. But I'm very convinced that the real presence of our distinguished guests online. On the 3rd of March 2020, the Dean and I co-led with our Roman Catholic opposite numbers a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And on day 2, we were told that we would not be able to go to Bethlehem, to the Church of the Nativity, the following day, because the West Bank was locked down. And we returned home at the end of a very blessed pilgrimage, unable to go into the West Bank. And I had no real foreboding that we were about to plunge into a lockdown in this country. And I hadn't fully understood the pace at which the global pandemic would take its grip. When it hit Southwark, I thought the best thing as bishop was to set up a task group, the coronavirus task group, which continues to meet and sends out regular bulletins to the diocese. And the purpose of this was to cope with the tsunami of information and advice, which was drowning us all, and to distill it and to send out in helpful ways communications. But in my first bulletin, I gave permission, something I thought I'd never do, to priests to say Mass solo on their own, partly because in that first lockdown, even priests were not allowed access to their churches. And it seemed for those like myself that have a tradition of a daily Eucharist wherever possible, that that was the very least that I could do as bishop. We also immediately started online worship, which was zoomed up from my chapel and with the help of my chaplain, and many others followed suit throughout our parishes. But it was to Richard and a series of conversations with him that I was able to reflect much more deeply on the Eucharistic theology behind all this. And Richard's asked me just to focus on that this evening. And as well as the practical in my own Eucharistic reflecting during this first lockdown, when there were restrictions on the Church's Eucharistic life, I became personally keenly aware of the communion of saints and the greater company. And although each time I was presiding at the Eucharist in my chapel and it was being broadcast, I was inviting people to make their spiritual communion. I had a great sense that we were actually tapping into that greater company, which of course is always there, but perhaps much more present in Eastern rather than Western Eucharistic understanding. And certainly if one reads Caesullus, that's very much at the heart of any Eucharistic celebration. So for me, I had rather stopped at thinking there was obviously the deprivation, but also there was a certain sufficiency in what was being provided. Certainly it was being offered in good faith. It was Richard who actually brought home very powerfully to me what it meant when one looked at it from the angle of exclusion. And I think, Richard, you've asked me to talk about this because you reflect on it and on some of our conversations.
And you were very generous in allowing me to quote our emails.
And that sense of exclusion, of course, Richard, being Richard, quoted Matthew 25 at me, when I was hungry, you did not feed me. So I wasn't able to escape from the hard and grim reality. But certainly that sense of what it meant to be truly excluded, what powerfully challenged me and disturbed me. And on the Chrism Mass, I think that was perhaps provoked a great broadside from Richard. I was in my chapel, the assistance of my chaplain to the world. I was there alone. We consecrated and blessed the wine. People then were invited to make their spiritual communion. There was renewal of vows. And Richard said that, and this is forensically deconstructed in the book, that there was a sense of utter exclusion as far as he was concerned. And what was I going to do about it? So I suggested that we had a conversation on Holy Saturday, Easter Eve, when I had a strong sense that Richard, and not only our Lord, was very clearly in the tomb. And from that conversation, I moved on to say two things. That I reflected that in our cathedral, when we had large celebrations, when we had diocesan celebrations, we would get people to stand in rows holding the vessels, and then the president would preside at the altar. There would be a symbolic chalice and paten on the altar, and they would be consecrated along with people raising their vessels. So therefore, if that arena of intention was there in the cathedral, what was stopping me from thinking that this could be extended further to virtual online worship and the validity of a consecration happening over a much greater scale? And I haven't yet come to an answer about that. I'm very grateful to Richard for challenging me on the subject. And the other consequence of that conversation on Easter Eve was that I then invited priests, if they wished, when there were services being broadcast, to concelebrate with me from their homes. But of course, as Richard would be the first to say, what about everyone else? So my thinking got to that point. Again, as Andrew was saying, I do not feel it's necessary to agree with Richard, but to be very grateful to him for the challenges and the challenge that is to all of us to think about our Eucharistic theology. What I love most about this book is the passion on every page for the celebration of the Eucharist. And recently we've been reminded of this following the death of Desmond Tutu, about his passion for a daily celebration of the Eucharist up until, I think, a day before his death. And Richard can attest to celebrations and assisting Desmond Tutu on trains and airport lounges, just so we can do what the Lord
I'd like to just respond a little bit to that, and then I will be introducing our other two speakers to talk specifically about online worship. But you're absolutely right, Bishop. I'm in tremendous grief at the moment about two things. One is the loss of my father in God, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And if you've read my piece in The Spectator, I've written a number of times about the Archbishop. I first met him back in 1990 when it was the first meeting back in South Africa between F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela, which put Tutu at the top of the British security concerns. And the armed police boarded the plane when they arrived, and people were told to stay with their seatbelts still on. Armed police brought Desmond and Leila Tutu and his 2 team members off the plane, straight into the Archbishop County VIP lounge where I was waiting, because the security was terribly worried that any right-winger in this country who tried to take a pot shot or throw something at Desmond Tutu on the day when the whole world was holding its breath for South Africa, it could easily disrupt what was going to happen in South Africa. But my first memory of him was coming into the Archbishop's lounge in Heathrow and saying, "Can we have the Eucharist?" And he was brought up by the monks of the Community of the Resurrection that he would not eat or drink until he'd received the Eucharist. And the police said, no, we've got to get you straight into the armed vehicles. I've never seen anybody put through immigration and passport control quite so quickly. We then rushed off to Reading, where we were meant to get the train to go down to Exeter, and the train was delayed. And in the end, the police put him, the only way they could keep people from mobbing him on the platform was put him into the security lounge, where he spent all the time zooming in on, another use of the word zoom, zooming in on people with security cameras around the station saying, "This is just what they do to me at home, you know, but why can't we have the communion?" And by this stage, it was like 10 o'clock in the morning, he'd been up all night on the plane. We eventually got onto the carriage, and what I knew, but he didn't, was that the half of the carriage was set aside, and the people who looked like businessmen with, and this is 1990, so they were holding mobile phones about the size of a half brick, were actually all armed special branch officers. And there was a small British Rail guy who was told he could only speak to me. And I said, he said, "You want your breakfast?" I said, "Yes, but first I need a small bottle of red wine and a piece of bread." And he looked at me and said, "Piece of bread for everybody, sir?" And I said, no, one piece of bread will be fine. Would you like me to cut it up for you, sir?" "No, I think the Archbishop will break it." And he'd been clearly instructed to be helpful and had no idea what I was talking about. So his last desperate attempt was would the Archbishop like it buttered, sir? And that was my first understanding of the fact that Desmond Tutu had to begin every day with the Eucharist. And for the next 20, 30 years, whenever he was in London, it was my job to make sure that there was somebody to have the Eucharist with him, because of the great tradition within the Church of England since the Reformation that the Bishop's already referred to, that the Eucharist is not something that we traditionally do on our own. And on those rare occasions when I was chaplain at Exeter or Dean of King's, doing a midweek communion and nobody turned up, I couldn't receive either. The other thing I'm in grief is that the last time I presided at the communion was what was, I thought, my farewell service from St Luke's Holloway in October 2019, when we moved up north. And those of you who remember, Martin Rowe and I did the service together, and then Justin gave a very typically Justin speech, and we were presented with a beautiful copy of Meg Rowe's icon. And that was the last time that I celebrated communion, because we moved to Manchester, and the next thing I knew, the little church where I started to go to midweek shut its doors, and it's not, I don't think it will ever reopen its doors. And it's been a great pain to me that I haven't been able to celebrate the Eucharist since that time, nor since I've been back in London.